On June 22, 1941, German soldiers marched into Russia wearing summer uniforms, confident they'd be home before the snow fell. By December, they were freezing to death at the gates of Moscow. War isn't always decided by brilliant strategy or superior firepower. Sometimes it's decided by catastrophic mistakes. In this video, we're going to explain the 8 biggest blunders of World War II. Decisions that didn't just lose battles, but cost hundreds of thousands of lives and changed the course of history. Let's start with what makes something a true blunder. We're not talking about bad luck or the fog of war. We're talking about fundamental failures in judgment, moments where arrogance, rigid thinking, or ego overruled common sense and intelligence. These are decisions where commanders had the information they needed, but chose to ignore it, where nations prepared for the last war instead of the next one, and where pride prevented retreat, even when retreat was the only rational choice. Blunder number 1, the Maginot Line mentality. France in 1940 provides our first example, and it reveals something crucial about military thinking. Fighting the war you want instead of the war you're facing is a recipe for disaster. After World War I, French military planners looked at the devastation of trench warfare and decided never again. They would build a wall so impregnable that Germany couldn't possibly break through. The Maginot Line became that wall. Billions of francs poured into concrete fortifications, artillery bunkers, and underground barracks stretching along the German border. It was engineering on a massive scale, a statement that France had learned from history, but history had also moved on. The French believed they were preventing another Verdun, another grinding war of attrition measured in yards of muddy ground. What they actually built was a monument to yesterday's thinking. The line's greatest vulnerability wasn't in its construction, but in what it represented, a defensive mindset that assumed the enemy would politely attack where you were strongest. The Ardennes forest sat north of the Maginot Line, a region of dense woods and rough terrain. French commanders considered it impassable for large mechanized forces. They left it lightly defended, assuming nature had built their fortification for them. This assumption revealed a deeper failure. They were thinking about tanks the way they'd thought about infantry in 1918, as something that moved slowly and needed perfect terrain. Lieutenant Carl Schmidt stood in the commander's hatch of his Panzer III, as his column emerged from the Ardennes onto French farmland. Behind him stretched an armored snake, dozens of miles long. Tanks, trucks, and half-tracks that had just driven through terrain the French swore was impassable. He'd expected minefields, concrete obstacles, concentrated artillery. Instead, he saw open roads and scattered resistance. The French hadn't just underestimated German tactics, they'd failed to imagine them at all. When German armor poured through that gap in May 1940, the entire French defensive strategy collapsed. The Maginot Line sat intact and useless, while panzers drove around it, encircling Allied armies and racing for the coast. France, one of Europe's great powers, fell in 6 weeks. The fortifications themselves never fell to assault. The garrisons inside only surrendered after the rest of France had already been conquered. Approximately 360,000 French and Allied soldiers were killed or wounded during the Battle of France, with nearly 2 million captured. The blunder wasn't building the line, it was believing the line was the strategy. Blunder number 2, Stalin's refusal to retreat at Kiev. This pattern of rigid thinking cost even more lives in the East. By September 1941, German forces had driven deep into Soviet territory, encircling the city of Kiev. Soviet generals could read a map as well as anyone. They saw the pincers closing and understood what was coming. They pleaded with Stalin to authorize a tactical withdrawal, to save the armies before the trap snapped shut. Military logic demanded retreat. Stalin demanded they hold. The order reflected Stalin's worldview, shaped by paranoia and ideology. Retreat meant weakness, and weakness invited treachery. Every step backward felt like surrender, like validating the capitalist prediction that the Soviet system would crumble under pressure. So, the order came down, not one step back. Hold Kiev at all costs. The costs were staggering. German forces completed the encirclement, trapping the entire Soviet Southwest Front. It became the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers killed or captured in a single operation. The road to Moscow lay open. Stalin's refusal to accept tactical reality hadn't saved Kiev. It had destroyed an entire army group that might have defended the capital. Here's the cruel irony. This disaster partially resulted from Hitler making the opposite mistake. German General Guderian had argued for driving straight to Moscow while the weather held, but Hitler overruled him, diverting forces to Ukraine to secure resources and destroy Soviet armies. The detour created the Kyiv catastrophe for the Soviets, but it also burned time the Germans couldn't afford. While they won a massive tactical victory, they delayed the drive on Moscow just long enough for winter to arrive. Blunder number 3, Operation Barbarossa and the winter delay, which brings us to the larger German blunder. The entire premise of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, rested on a fundamental miscalculation that would kill over 1 million German soldiers, the assumption of a quick victory. German planners believed the Red Army would collapse within weeks, that the Soviet system was so rotten it would fall apart under the first serious blow. This wasn't strategy, it was wishful thinking dressed up as analysis. The invasion began in June 1941 with stunning initial success. German forces advanced hundreds of miles, destroyed entire Soviet armies, and seemed to validate Hitler's predictions. But the Soviets didn't collapse. They fell back, they took horrific losses, but they kept fighting. And as summer turned to autumn, and autumn turned to winter, the Germans discovered they'd planned for the war they wanted rather than the war they were fighting. Sergeant Franz Müller crouched in a frozen shell hole outside Moscow, trying to load his rifle with fingers he could barely feel. The bolt mechanism had frozen solid. Happened every morning now. Around him, his squad huddled in summer uniforms stuffed with newspaper for insulation, wearing Russian felt boots scavenged from corpses because their own boots had cracked in the cold. The company half-track sat abandoned 200 yards back, engine seized when the oil turned to sludge at -40 degrees. Command kept saying supply trucks were coming with winter gear, but the trucks themselves couldn't start. The German military had conquered France in 6 weeks, but hadn't produced winter coats for the invasion of Russia because planners genuinely believed the war would be over before the first snow. When temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, vehicles froze, weapons jammed, and soldiers died of exposure in positions they couldn't abandon. The Wehrmacht reached the gates of Moscow and could go no further. What was supposed to be a lightning campaign became a grinding war of attrition on 2 fronts, exactly the scenario German strategy had sought to avoid since 1914. Over 1 million German casualties by the end of that first winter. The numbers tell part of the story, but the real cost was strategic. Germany had bet everything on a quick knockout blow. When that failed, they were committed to fighting the largest nation on earth with finite resources while still facing Britain in the West. The blunder wasn't just tactical, it was existential. Blunder number 4, the Pearl Harbor strategy failure. While Germany struggled in Russia, Japan made a blunder of the opposite kind. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft executed a near-perfect tactical strike on Pearl Harbor. American battleships burned and sank, American casualties mounted. By any military measure, the attack was brilliantly executed. But brilliant tactics don't always serve sound strategy. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching smoke rise from Pearl Harbor. His strike commanders were requesting permission for a third wave. They'd destroyed the battleships. Now they wanted to finish the job by targeting the fuel storage tanks and repair facilities. Nagumo calculated the risks. His carriers were exposed. American forces were now alert, and he'd already achieved his primary objective of crippling the Pacific Fleet. He ordered the task force to withdraw. That decision revealed a crucial misunderstanding of what actually mattered. Battleships were impressive and symbolically important, but the naval war in the Pacific would be decided by carriers and submarines. The Japanese had sunk obsolete ships while missing the targets that would actually prolong the war. American carriers weren't in port. They survived to become the core of the Pacific Fleet's striking power. The fuel storage tanks held 4.5 million barrels of oil. Destroying them would have set back American operations by years. The repair facilities and dry docks remained intact, allowing the U.S. Navy to recover much faster than Japan had anticipated. Admiral Nimitz later stated that if the Japanese had destroyed those oil reserves, the war would have been prolonged by at least 2 years. Instead, the attack that was meant to cripple American power in the Pacific, bought Japan perhaps 6 months before American industrial might and surviving carrier strength began grinding down Japanese positions across the ocean. The tactical victory sparked a strategic disaster, awakening American industrial power while failing to deliver a truly crippling blow. The attack killed 2,400 Americans. It led to the eventual death of over 2 million Japanese soldiers and civilians as the United States prosecuted total war across the Pacific. Blunder number 5, the fall of Singapore. The pattern repeated elsewhere. In February 1942, the British learned the same lesson France had learned about assumptions and unpreparedness. Singapore, called the Gibraltar of the East, bristled with massive coastal artillery pointed out to sea. British planners had prepared for a naval assault, great guns positioned to blow Japanese ships out of the water. But the Japanese didn't come by sea. They came through the Malaysian jungle on bicycles. Commander Arthur Percival had assumed the jungle was impassable, just as the French had assumed the Ardennes was impassable. That assumption meant minimal landward defenses, scattered units, and no coherent defense plan for an overland attack. When Japanese forces emerged from terrain the British thought was their ally, the defensive strategy evaporated. In the British command bunker, an officer tallied the numbers for Percival: 85,000 Allied troops under his command versus roughly 40,000 Japanese attackers. By every military calculation, the defenders held the advantage. But numbers don't fight, soldiers do, and organization matters. The Japanese were concentrated, aggressive, and moving with purpose. The British were scattered, demoralized, and waiting for orders that would make sense of the chaos. What Percival didn't know was that the Japanese were hours away from retreating themselves. They were running out of ammunition. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and a determined counterattack might have broken them. But the British surrendered first. It was a bluff that worked perfectly. 130,000 Allied troops killed or captured, overwhelmed by a force half their size. The humiliation of the British Empire couldn't be overstated. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen in days because someone had pointed the guns in the wrong direction. Blunder number 6, Hitler's no retreat at Stalingrad. Hitler repeated Stalin's mistake at Stalingrad, proving that ideology and ego can override military sense, regardless of the uniform. By November 1942, Soviet forces had launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that encircled the German 6th Army in Stalingrad. General Paulus, trapped with hundreds of thousands of men, could read the situation clearly. Break out now while there's still a corridor. Link up with German lines. Save the army to fight another day. He requested permission to retreat. Hitler's response revealed the same rigid thinking that had destroyed Soviet armies at Kiev. Hold at all costs. The 6th Army would stand and fight. More than that, Hitler promised the Luftwaffe would supply them by air, delivering everything the trapped army needed to hold out until relief arrived. It was a mathematical impossibility, but it was an order. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, Corporal Hans Weber watched the supply plane circle overhead, too high to avoid Soviet anti-aircraft fire. It dropped its cargo containers without landing. Most smashed on impact or drifted into Soviet lines. The ones they recovered held dress uniforms and summer socks instead of ammunition and food. The Luftwaffe had promised 300 tons of supplies daily. They were averaging 90. Men were eating their leather belts and fighting over frozen horse meat, and still, the order was to hold. The 6th Army starved and froze over 4 months. Approximately 800,000 Axis casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only 6,000 ever returned home. Stalingrad became the psychological turning point of the war in the East. Germany never won another major offensive. Hitler's refusal to accept reality hadn't saved an army. It had destroyed one and shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. Blunder number 7, Operation Market Garden. By 1944, as Allied forces pushed into Europe from the West, overconfidence created disasters on both sides. Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Market Garden stands as perhaps the war's most avoidable catastrophe, a case where commanders ignored intelligence because it contradicted what they wanted to believe. The plan was elegant. Drop 35,000 paratroopers behind German lines to seize a series of bridges across Holland, creating a corridor straight into Germany. Done right, it might end the war by Christmas. But Montgomery's staff ignored intelligence reports showing panzer divisions resting in the operational area. The photos were clear, the reports were detailed, but they were dismissed as exaggerated or irrelevant. The paratroopers also carried radios that didn't function properly in the Dutch terrain, meaning units couldn't coordinate or call for support. These weren't secret problems. Planners knew about them, but the plan had momentum and the promise of glory. At Arnhem Bridge, Captain John Frost and his battalion held against increasing German pressure, waiting for relief that would never arrive. Their radios crackled with static or silence. They couldn't reach headquarters, couldn't coordinate with other units, could barely communicate between their own positions. Across town, panzer tanks that weren't supposed to exist began systematically destroying British positions. The intelligence had been accurate. They'd been dropped into a trap, and now they were paying for someone else's overconfidence. The operation collapsed. The paratroopers at Arnhem were cut off and slaughtered. 17,000 Allied casualties in 9 days, more than D-Day, and the war dragged on for another 8 months. A British officer had even carried the complete operation plans with him on a glider that crashed behind German lines. The Germans found the documents, but assumed they were a fake, because, surely, no one would be foolish enough to carry the master plan into battle. They were wrong. The British really had been that careless. Blunder number 8, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In the Pacific, the Japanese Navy made its final catastrophic error at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Admiral Kurita commanded a powerful surface fleet, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, sent to destroy American landing forces in the Philippines. The plan worked almost perfectly. American carriers had been lured away by a decoy force. Kurita's battleships broke through into Leyte Gulf with the defenseless American transports and landing craft spread out before them. Victory was within reach. Then everything went wrong. A tiny American force, escort carriers and destroyers, designated Taffy 3, threw themselves at the Japanese battleships in what should have been a suicide charge. These weren't fleet carriers or heavy cruisers. They were small ships meant for support, not surface combat. But they attacked with such ferocity that Kurita began to doubt his intelligence. Aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans ordered his ship straight at the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. The Johnston's 5-inch guns couldn't seriously damage a battleship, but Evans fired anyway, launching torpedoes and making smoke, charging at full speed. Around him, other destroyers and escort carriers did the same, acting like they were the vanguard of a massive fleet, rather than a handful of ships, buying time for the transports behind them. Kurita interpreted the desperate American aggression as evidence of a trap. He assumed these ships must be the screening force for the American fleet carriers, that if he pushed forward, he'd be caught by overwhelming force. Shaken and confused, with his own ships taking damage from the suicidal American attacks, Kurita ordered his battleships to turn around and retreat, just as victory was within grasp. The Japanese Navy lost its last chance to inflict a strategic defeat on American forces. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Navy was effectively finished as a fighting force. 12,500 Japanese sailors died. 3,000 Americans died. But the battle decided the naval war in the Pacific. World War II wasn't decided by weapons alone, but by decisions made with confidence and flawed assumptions. Again and again, leaders ignored reality, trusted ego over intelligence, and paid for it with human lives. These blunders remind us that war punishes rigidity more than weakness, and arrogance more than fear. History doesn't repeat because generals are stupid. It repeats because human nature doesn't change. If you found this breakdown valuable, like the video, subscribe for more deep war analysis, and comment which World War II blunder shocked you the most.